Hey everybody, welcome back. It is Ryan with the Milwaukee Facebook group. We are doing a follow-up training this time, and I'm really excited. We have Al Speigel back here with McLario Law Firm up in Menominee Falls, and today we're talking about something that I personally am excited to learn about because it's all about estate planning. For those of us that don't know a lot about estate planning or don't know the in-depths of it, Al's here to really help us and walk us through some of the most important elements we need to consider when planning the estate for the time in the future. So Al, welcome back. We're excited to have you. Thanks for taking the time today.
Hey, my pleasure. I'm excited to be back.
Awesome. So obviously, Al, we talked a lot about with you before about your business. We know you're obviously an attorney, very accomplished, been in the business for a long time, but can you tell us a little bit of why you're really qualified to help explain estate planning to those who are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I always start with is that I have I guess it's a privilege of having the experience of going and trying to untangle these messes after they've been made. I've been in court with people after someone's died, and we have two different versions of a will or a document someone wrote that we're not sure if is really an amendment, or all sorts of different scenarios like that. So I've seen them go wrong, and I've seen the heartache that it causes, and the expense, and the uncertainty that it causes. So having been on that side of things, it's a lot easier for me to want to proactively and preemptively kind of create estate plan documents that are going to prevent those kind of disputes from happening. We can't prevent everything, but we can certainly prevent the more common problems that we see in estate planning.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure, for a lot of people, it's tough to talk about that kind of stuff because no one wants to think about that. But eventually, someday, you're not going to be here. And when that happens, can you line everything up correctly so that everything's carried out in the best way that serves everybody? And that's,
Yeah, and I think it is really easy for people to kind of not want to deal with their own mortality. And I get that. And I think when doing what I do for a living, you sort of just, of course, we should talk about this because I have all these reasons and all these stories. But for most people, it's not something they touch on a lot in their lives. But when people really get to thinking, what kind of a legacy do I want to leave? And what kind of status do I want to leave my family in if something were to happen? It's very often the case that someone goes through a bad experience with another family member who doesn't plan and says, never will that be me. And that gets them in the door to get an estate plan done. My hope is that people can just appreciate, hey, let's leave a legacy, not just of money, but of peace and of problem solving and of priorities that show people what you were really about.
yeah, I hear you. I actually had good experience with it, not personally, but I watched it happen. So a few years ago, my grandmother unexpectedly passed away, and she was only in her early 60s, and so she really, it was very surprising to everybody, but she had actually taken care of a lot of this stuff already. She had all the documentation, and it was all nicely done. It actually made the process, even though I was a bystander, right? It was my parents that were dealing with it, not me, but I watched it go through very methodically and rather quickly, and I was kind of surprised. Like, I really was impressed with all that. I didn't understand at the time. I was too young to really figure out, oh, that was an estate plan. But looking back on it, I saw all the documents. There was a ton of documentation. It was all well thoroughly done. There was no disputing going on between my parents and the aunts and uncles. Everything worked out really well, actually. So I can see the benefit of that, because on the alternative, I can imagine that being really sloppy.
Absolutely. Well, and it's kind of like you compare a good funeral to a bad funeral. The bad funerals, people are arguing and there's hurt feelings and there's all sorts of things going on below the surface or at the surface. And a good funeral, you're really celebrating who that person was and being thankful for all the blessings they brought into your life. And it kind of is an extension of that to be able to say, boy, Grandma, that was really great that you did that for us. And now we can look back on our time with you fondly instead of going, boy, I wish you would have thought about this a little more. You kind of left us in a mess.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really why I was excited to have this call with you today and kind of give people, the 30,000-foot view of what does estate planning look like. Obviously, every topic we could do today could go into a massive amount of depth. That's for, down the road. Everyone that's interested, contact Al, get more details, get this stuff taken care of. But today, high level, going through some basics, fundamentals, and things that people should think about when they're thinking about, okay, what's estate planning? What should I do? So Al, can you kind of give us the high level? What is estate planning? Define it for those people like me who are very unknowledgeable in this area.
Sure, I define estate planning as the process of making the effort to make sure that your wishes are carried out with regard to your property, and who's going to be in charge of things and what happens with your kids and all the different things that might happen in the event of your death or in the event of your incapacity. That's one we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. But a person that's in our sort of demographic is much more likely to become incapacitated for a while than we are to die. We have to plan for that because that can become a really devastating financial situation for our family.
Yeah. Yeah, that part always has caught me because again, not knowing a lot about this, I always kind of assumed, oh, estate planning is for those super ultra wealthy people, but you're making it seem like everyone should have one. Why is that?
Sure. Well, let me give you an example. The work I do is just
Yeah.
full of stories. I was recently hired by a couple whose son was in his 20s, and like most people in their 20s, thought he was going to live forever and never did any estate plan. And frankly, most of the time, they're right. Well, not about the living forever part, but about the not needing anything. Unfortunately, he was in a car accident and lost capacity. He became incapacitated, wasn't able to make legal decisions for himself. And because he didn't have powers of attorney that named his parents to be able to make those decisions for him, he was an adult in the eyes of the law. And because he was an adult, his parents actually had to go through the court system to get named as his guardians so that they could make basic financial decisions for him, like paying his bills. I
Wow.
believe he had a house they had to kind of manage as far as whether they should sell it or not. And all of that had to be supervised and approved by the court. And I mean, not only was it stressful and pain, and sort of long suffering, it took a long time, but it was also very expensive. They ended up spending thousands and thousands of dollars to go through a process that really shouldn't have been necessary.
Wow. Yeah, stories definitely help highlight that because myself included, when I was in my 20s, I'm invincible. Nothing's shaking this tree. I
Right.
got this. And then something out of control happens, and boom. I would naturally assume like parents sort of have this all-encompassing authority forever. At least I do with my kids, right?
Sure.
And then you hit the 18-year-old part, and it's like, nope, legally you're an adult, and it's kind of interesting when you think about it from that perspective of the what if could happen element. So
Sure.
interesting. Okay. So let's say someone like me wanted to create an estate plan. What are some of the basic elemental things that I will need to make that happen?
Yeah, good question. And let me kind of give you I'll start with maybe a step before the three areas we really need to cover when we're
Sure.
talking about an estate plan. We're talking about having a plan for your finances in the event that you are incapacitated. So somebody to make financial decisions for you. Financial power of attorney or a durable power of attorney is the document that typically handles that.
Nice.
Second thing, similar but for healthcare decisions. You want to name someone who can make healthcare decisions for you. Again, if you're not able. If you're able, you make them yourself, whether you can
Mhm.
wiggle your toes or write on a chalkboard or just say it. But you want to have that in place. And then the third thing, the thing that we really spend most of our time thinking about in estate planning, is a plan for what happens to your property and your children, and whatever else is going on in your life in the event of your death. So those are kind of the three areas we want to cover in any good estate plan. And there are a few different ways to cover some of those. Really, the first two, you need a healthcare power of attorney and a financial power of attorney. Every adult in the state of Wisconsin needs one of those. And I would assume all over the country, they might be called something different, but you need something to address those situations. And then the at death, or in the event of death matters, there are a few different ways to get to where you need to go, but we need to address that as well. So those are the documents you need. Now, your question was, what do you kind of need to get started with that? And
Yeah.
really, it's what I find as far as how people react is it's a lot more simple than they think it's going to be. When someone calls me and says, I need to get an estate plan, whatever usually there's a reason. Um, Before all this coronavirus stuff started, the reason was very often we're about to go on a long vacation. And sometime, for some reason, when people are going to get on a boat or a plane, they get real concerned about their own mortality. That
Fair enough.
and I guess as far as my business is concerned, I guess I'm glad that something spurs that. So
Mhm.
so they'll call me and say, all right, what do I need to do? And what we do is we send them literally a 3 or 4 page document that they need to fill out. So we know their legal names, their kids. We have some sort of check the box questions as far as, do any of your children have a disability? Are you receiving state benefits? Different things that I need to know in
Sure.
order to make a good estate plan for them. And once I get back from them, and it also includes a general sort of survey of what their property is. I need to know if somebody owns 10 apartment buildings or has a helicopter collection or, whatever, because that's going to affect what I do. And then they send that back to me. I think if someone sits down and does it, it might take them 15 or 20 minutes to fill it out. They send it back to me and we have a phone call for 15, 20 minutes and really talk about, okay, now I have all the basics in place. Now let's talk about how you want this to look and what you want to accomplish. And then at the end of that call, I make them recommendations to say, all right, there's a couple different ways we can do this. There's pros and cons. Here's what you're looking for as far as what I would recommend. And they decide whether they want to go forward or not. So that's really the most of the process until I actually do drafting.
Nice, nice. You mentioned the helicopter collection. I wish that Tonka trucks, were worth anything, because my kids have plenty of those, and I would be able to list, 3 pages of Tonka trucks.
Absolutely. Actually, this is probably about your generation too. I know my boys were looking through my old stuff and they pulled out my old starting lineup figures. Do you remember those?
Really? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Back.
Baseball players? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they're not worth anything still. So
Yeah. There's a whole lot of stuff I got that isn't worth anything. That's too
50
bad.
more years, they're gonna turn it around.
Maybe. All right. So I know that there's 3 major things that you talked about already, and that's kind of the 3 things we're going to jump into today and help people understand at least some of the core things about, putting together the financial power of attorney, the healthcare one, and sort of a will, or after death, we may have time for looking into trusts and stuff like that. But let's start with those first 2, the power of attorneys. Now, I'm, being uneducated in this space myself, I always thought they're the same person. Do they have to be the same person, or how does that whole thing work?
They don't have to be the same person. In many cases, you have someone, if you have adult children and one of them lives down the block and kind of is around more than others, it may be that it's the same person, but it's certainly not unusual for it to be, all right, I have one child who's an accountant, I have another child who's a nurse. We're going to have the accountant handle the financial stuff and the nurse handle the medical stuff. So
Makes sense.
that can vary. Certainly people who are married, their spouse is almost always first up unless there's some kind of complication with that. But that's 99% of the documents that I do for married people. It's first spouse and then whoever after that.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. In let's say, for example, a younger person like me were to name my parents in, one of those, and is there a third line you can also put? Because what if in a few years they pass away and all of a sudden, how many people can you put on that as like the line of chain of command or something, I would call it?
Sure, good question. There certainly isn't a limit of people. When people ask me that question, I usually tell them 3 or 4 is plenty, just
Mm-hmm.
because I'll get the family with 8 kids that wants to mention everybody. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just, at
Sure.
some point, it becomes very, very unlikely that a person's really going to be serving in that capacity, and it just makes the document more confusing to read. But
Sure.
I mean, certainly I would say, especially when you're talking about an older generation, you're going to want to have someone as a backup who is in a younger generation
Yeah.
to make sure they're going to be around.
Good. I was always curious about that, because I think, people are often asking those kinds of questions. So I'll ask it now. Got you on the
Absolutely.
phone.
And I think I remember you have younger kids,
I
and
do.
people ask the same kind of question about guardians. Oh, I
Mhm.
got my parents as the first guardian. Is that okay? And that's a discussion we have about, should they still be? A lot of times I'll have people say, oh, my parents are 60. In 10 years they're going to be 70, and my
Yeah.
my quick response is usually, well, we should be reviewing this more frequently than every 10 years. So if you want to put them on for now, I think that makes sense. But it's up to them.
Yeah. And you can make a secondary guardian is what you're saying. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
okay. Perfect. Good. All right. Jumping over to the healthcare power of attorney. There's, I know that you mentioned something in one of your other YouTube videos about a records release. What is that, and kind of how does that differ from the actual power of attorney?
Sure, good question. So the power of attorney is the document that names someone else to act in your place and make medical decisions that you would have made had you been competent. So that's the purpose of the healthcare power of attorney. Now, what we've seen in the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years is the rise of healthcare privacy laws, which are really good. I mean, I'm glad my healthcare records are confidential,
Yeah.
but in some circumstances, those can cause a lot of heartache, particularly if someone named as your healthcare power of attorney and they for some reason don't have the ability to get to your medical records. Now
Hmm.
suddenly you have authority to make decisions, but no ability to get information. That puts everyone in a bad situation. Now I think typically in those situations, the doctors are going to release information, but if they get it up to the lawyers at the hospital, the lawyers are probably going to say, we need a records release or we're violating the law. So what we do is when we sign a healthcare power of attorney with clients, we have them sign what's called a Hipaa release that just says the people named on my healthcare records release, on my healthcare power of attorney, can view my medical records and talk to my doctors
Yeah.
while they're in the process of making decisions.
That's a big one, actually, because man, I can imagine someone being really frustrated if all of a sudden they're the healthcare power of attorney and they have no idea. I mean, honestly, I don't know that my family knows all of the detailed history of me. My wife obviously does, but since then, probably don't know as much. So that's a huge important thing.
Right. Well, the other nice thing for that is that it gives them the ability to contact doctors. If you get in a car accident and your parents want to call and see how you're doing, your doctor just can't answer the phone and give out information about your care, even if it's to your mom or your dad or your uncle or whatever. They need that authorization to talk to them. So that even if you're not incapacitated yet, it gives them that ability to sort of have access to the situation in the first place.
Yeah, that's big. That's a really big one because you never know when things could happen. Good, good.
Oh,
That's a really
sure.
good question.
Well, the other thing I would say about that is a lot of this is affected by the rise of the non-traditional family, where you have people who have been living together for a real long time,
True.
who aren't spouses, and all these different arrangements that weren't very common, 40 years ago. That there's a lot of that out there, and those people, if you're living with someone, you probably want that person to be able to kind of act like your spouse if something happens to you, and these
Mhm.
documents allow that to happen. Whereas otherwise, they're just a third party who happens to be your roommate, and I'm sure that's not how you'd want to
Yeah.
be treated.
Legally, that gives them no power. Good. All right.
Exactly. And there's some really ugly situations where that's the case, where something happens to the person who owns the house, and the live-in girlfriend gets an eviction notice from the
Mm.
kids the next day that says, "We never liked you, get out." And that certainly is not likely to be what that home wanted. So we got to make that stuff clear even more in the kind of non-traditional situations.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a big element as well. Wow. I mean, I know a lot of people that are living together that have no legal ties to each other. So that's a big one to
Right.
consider, especially with things happening and changing all over the place. So, well, good. That I think that answers a lot of good questions about the healthcare side. I know anything else that jumps out at you that you need to say, hey, think of this, remember this on the healthcare side?
Yeah, well, and the other thing I would say is a lot of times people think about the health or power of attorney as just limited to end of life decisions. They think about, I get a lot of people who are sort of uncomfortable in my office signing them and make jokes about pulling the plug and all this stuff. And that's a very small part of what goes on in the healthcare power of attorney. But it's much more so that that person can manage treatment for you, hopefully so that you can regain capacity. So you want to have that there because otherwise there's just sort of this legal gray area that happens. And until a judge gets involved and approves someone to make those decisions, you just kind of sit there and they're just sustaining you, probably, maybe at least in what you don't want to be sustained.
Mm, yeah, and could be potentially delaying the treatment that might actually help you, right? Sustaining
Right.
is not improving necessarily, and it's very
Right.
distinct, like in hospitals. So,
Absolutely. You look at different things like, experimental treatments or things that you might want to get involved in, but doctors can't do that unless there's legal consent. And there can't be legal consent unless there's a document that authorizes someone to give it for you.
gotcha, gotcha. Interesting thought popped into my head. In the event that you become incapacitated, where do these documents physically live? Like, how does someone track them down and say, "Oh, look, don't forget, we have this, healthcare power of attorney or whatever." Do they live at the lawyer's office? Do they live at their house? Do they live anywhere that someone could find them easily?
Good question. We try not to have them live at the lawyer's office because we close at 5 p.m. and we are gone all weekend. So, if
True.
someone has the note to become incapacitated over the weekend, it doesn't help them a lot. So, what I usually tell people is if particularly the healthcare documents, that's when you're going to want to get to your doctor's office and have them scan in. So it's part of your medical record. And they typically, when you check in for an appointment, they'll ask you, do you have these documents? It's kind of when they ask you for the 15th time, has your insurance been updated? And you give them the
Mhm.
same card and scan it in. That's the time when you can give them your power of attorney papers and have them scan it in. So that's part of your medical record. So wherever you go, at least in theory, they're going to have access to that document.
Nice. That's a good idea. Oh, Man, that was a huge one for me to learn right there because I had no idea what would happen with those things. Like,
Sure.
yeah, you got a document, but if no one reads it, does it exist?
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like a tree falling in the woods. We
Yes,
got some
exactly what
kind
I
of,
was thinking about. Yeah. All right, good. Okay, let's shift gears then and go into the financial one because I know that's also a big one for a lot of people is this idea that someone controls, the money, the assets, and everything in the event that you become. Is it specifically more like death, or does that one also have any power when incapacitated?
good question. And actually, it's even broader than just incapacity because typically the documents that we draft, talking about a financial power of attorney, is effective when it's signed. So it gives someone the ability to go to the bank and manage your accounts or pay your bills or do whatever you need as of the date of signature without having to prove that you're incapacitated. And the reason we do it that way is because it's real hard for Chase Bank or US Bank or Wells Fargo or whoever to know whether you have capacity or not. They certainly don't want to be, hiring doctors to make those determinations for you. They'd rather have a document in front of them that says this person can act right now. You don't need to ask any questions. And in the right situation, that's what people want. You don't want to have to go running around and getting paperwork filled out just to be able to pay someone's mortgage or sign papers to get them into some kind of a care facility.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that's
so that document typically, now we can do it differently. We don't typically recommend it that way. Typically is effective from when it's signed until a person's death. It expires at death because then you're going to get into the trusts and the wills and all those things. But
gotcha.
that's the scope of the financial power of attorney, and that's one, frankly, that people struggle with. I mean, probably an American thing. We all want to make sure we're the ones who are managing our finances, and
Hmm.
I completely understand that. But we certainly don't want the courts to be the next people after us if something happens to us. And this is a way to circumvent that process and just name someone. You talked about where to save the healthcare powers of attorney. The financial power of attorney is one that I'm more, put it in a safe in your house and just know person who's going to act in that capacity know where to find it if they need it. They don't need to have it on their person at all times. Maybe you want them to, kind of depends. If you're
Hmm.
102 years old, maybe that's what you should do. But if you're,
Yeah,
if you're more in our demographic, maybe it's just if something happens, go find the green folder. It'll tell you everything you need to know. And in there will be the financial power of attorney.
gotcha. Same question with the healthcare thing. Can you list a couple of different people, assuming again the parents aspect, and can you list more? And can you is there a way to to word it so that I don't want like 10 people having access. Maybe I want one first, and then if they can't do it, then the second person is entitled, but not until the first one says no or something like that. I don't know. Kind of just
Absolutely.
spitballing here.
Yep, I'll kind of answer for both of those. On both of those documents, it's certainly one, and if not that one, then the next. On
Perfect.
both documents, it is possible to have a group of people acting at the same time. So if you have two kids, you can say, my two sons are co-powers of attorney. I don't mind that on financial powers of attorney. I
Hmm.
don't like it on healthcare powers of attorney because I don't ever want there to be a tie, and then you lay there while your
True.
kids
Yeah.
fight it out,
Yeah. That's
especially
fair.
something that's that emotional and people have such strong opinions on, because those are the kind of cases where you read about once in a while where someone lays in a coma for 20 years while their families fight about it in their, and you don't want that. I always tell people, pick someone, tell them you're going to haunt them if they're not nice to everyone else, but give them the authority to make the decisions they need to make for you.
Okay. Well, good. That makes a lot of sense, in terms of the differences between the two of them. And I completely agree on the healthcare side. It's just someone you got to trust, and the financial side, someone you got to trust, but can be different. So good.
And I always tell people, when people are still pushing me on wanting to have, their two kids or their three kids act together on healthcare decisions, I always say, do you really want Congress making your healthcare decisions? And that's usually enough to get them to back off on the idea.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Oh, well, good. I think anything else on the financial side, that honestly, that makes a whole lot of sense. I know that those all tie together with other things, but from a high level perspective, anything else that someone should know?
I guess I'd come back to the main point is that every competent adult in the state of Wisconsin needs a healthcare and a financial power of attorney. It doesn't matter if you have no money, you have financial decisions, you have taxes that may be filed, you have contracts you might need to sign. and you have a body that's going to need to be taken care of in a medical sense if something happens. So
Hmm.
those two documents everybody needs, and they're really, and if you were to come into my office to get them, you might spend $200 or $250 to get those done. So we're not talking about a major financial expense.
Yeah, that's
I
good.
just did a, I just did a guardianship for someone who didn't have them, and I think they spent about $3,500 going through the court process. Now, I don't say this to shame them. Obviously, I'm sure they would go back and do it, but
Yeah.
that's that's the balance that we're talking about. And then it's just done. And you have some of the conversations that you should be having anyways about what's important to you and how things should be handled if something happens.
Yeah, well, that's good. Okay, let's shift a little bit into sort of the will and the trust element. These are things that, from my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong, happen and occur once you are no longer alive, and that's when those sort of kick in and allow that document to become a valid or living document, whatever the right word is. Can you tell us what is the difference between a will and a trust, and sort of how do they operate?
Sure. Well, let me again, I'm going to back up just a step to kind of give you the
Yeah,
context for
please.
how this works. So if a person in Wisconsin dies and has no will or no trust in place, the state has a procedure and a sort of a pecking order of where their property goes and how it needs to be administered. And that really requires any relative or creditor of that person to go file a petition in the court and ask to be named the executor of that person's estate. And then there's an order for how things are going to be paid. And then how assets are distributed is really based on the legislature having decided, okay, if a person dies and has has no kids, it goes to their spouse. If they don't have a spouse, it goes to their parents. If they don't have parents, it goes to their siblings. I mean, everyone has parents. Their parents aren't living. I mean, and on and on and on. All of which is okay, but it's really the state making the decision for you in the absence of a plan.
Mm,
And what we're talking about doing with a will or a trust or a couple other options is making you the person who decides what happens with your assets instead of this other process. You know, for example, I have a lot of clients who are middle-aged and don't have children, and they have elderly parents. If they don't have an estate plan, all
mhm.
of their assets are going to go to their elderly parents, who not only don't need it, but it could goof up assistance they're receiving for, Medicaid and nursing home and all that kind of stuff. And that money could end up really just going right down the toilet, where they could give it to a niece or nephew for college, or donate to a charity, or do whatever else they might think is appropriate. So that's kind of the context for people making an estate plan. It's you deciding to be the decision maker in what happens in the event of your death, instead of just letting it default to the state. And the state did its best. It's not a bad plan for the state, but frankly, it's based on the way families looked about 75 years ago. And a lot of those things are different. We have step families and people that have been together a long time who are kind of spouses, and all these other things that should really be taken into consideration individually. So the first way we assert some control over things is what's called a will. Called a last will and testament, or a will. And that's a document where you just say, whatever is left in my name at the time of my death is going to go in this way. It's going to be distributed in this way. And you can have contingency plans, if this person doesn't survive, then this, or all those sort of things.
Mhm.
And here are the people that are going to be in charge of administering it. You get to decide who's going to be the person that's in charge. And what I always tell people is, with a will or a trust, you get to decide who's in charge, and not just let your most aggressive relative be in charge of administering your estate, because that's how it's going to work. The
Yep.
person who's most
Yep.
familiar with the court system, because they've been in child support court 100 times, or they've disputed other people's estates or whatever.
Mhm.
So you get to make that decision. Now, the downfall with a will is that a will still has to go through the county and get administered through the courts, because that register and probate still administers people who have wills. So you got to go through the same process that a person without a will has to go through. The only difference is you have already determined what the rules of that process are. So a judge is going to
Oh,
approve your will as long as it's correctly fashioned, but it's still got to be public, and it's still going to take a long time, and it's still going to cost you a fair amount of money to have a lawyer like me walk through that process that in many cases isn't really necessary.
mm,
So that's a will. The next sort of step is a trust. And what we do with the trust is a vehicle whereby, instead of keeping things in your name after your death and having the court administer them. The trust is something you set up privately and then put everything into the name of the trust. So it's kind of like owning a business, putting all your stuff into the name of that business and making yourself the manager of that business. But then at your death, instead of anything being left for the courts, you then say, here's who the next manager is going to be, and here's how I want to have it happen at my death. So you've laid this all out in advance so it can all happen privately and quickly and inexpensively. So that's the real benefit of a trust. Now, the downside is it costs more money than a will. However, the money that you save on not having to go through the courts is going to far outweigh the extra dollars you're going to spend setting it up.
Sure. Okay. If someone, let's say, gets a will when they're younger and they want to transition into a trust later, is that possible?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a new document, but you're never locked into an estate plan, whether it's a trust or a will. I shouldn't say that. There are certain estate plans that people voluntarily lock themselves into, but that's pretty uncommon at this point. It's not. There are very specific circumstances you might want to do that, and I barely ever see those circumstances.
Gotcha. Very cool. Well, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess the way that popped into my head is when you die, you want the courts to tell you what's going on, or you want to tell them what's going on, right? It's going to go to the courts either way, but you still get to be the driver, or you want to be the passenger.
Right. Well, and it's going to go through the courts either way if it's a will. The trust becomes out of that process. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I like being the driver, so
absolutely.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, I was watching your YouTube channel, and you said there's a little bit of a difference between a living will and a last will and testament. Are those two things different, and if so, how and why?
Yeah, they are vastly different documents. It's very unfortunate that they're so similarly named.
Yeah.
So a living will is a document we don't actually do much anymore. But a living will is the document that people used to do where it said, if I'm in a persistent vegetative state, I want A, all measures to be used to keep me alive, or B, minimal measures and let me go. And then there's a series of about 5 questions just on those kind of healthcare decisions to give people guidance about what your wishes are in those situations. That's a living will. A last will and testament has nothing to do with any of that. It's all about property. It's all about here's what happens with my property. Here's who's going to be the guardian of my kids. And here's the terms under which I want everything to be distributed. So completely different documents with names that are almost identical and often interchanged, which is really unfortunate, because it isn't unusual for someone to say, "Oh, I just want to get a living will. That's all I need," and it's not all they need. They don't need it at all. But I know what they're talking about, so we kind of start the conversation from there. Good question.
Exactly why I had the question, because I was like, I don't get it. Why are there two different things that are so closely named, but now that you've explained them, they're vastly different in their execution. Yeah. It's hilarious. All right. Now, again, back to your channel, because it's had a lot of good information in there. There are things that can trump a will, and this I was surprised to find out. Can you walk us through those things? What happens and what actually can trump the will? Because I thought the will is like my decree of like what I want to happen after I die. Now, what can trump that?
Yep, absolutely. And this is a common mistake people make. They'll put together a nice estate plan, whether it's a will or a trust or whatever it is, and say, "Don't worry, I have it all together." But then there are certain circumstances where we never even get to the will or the trust. And I'll give you the 2 most common ones. The first one is if you jointly own property with someone. So most commonly your spouse. And that's why when a spouse dies, typically there isn't an estate to speak of. You don't have to go through the courts because for me, everything I own has my wife's name on it too, and vice versa. And that's on purpose. And I appreciate her letting me be on the title of all that stuff. That's
exactly.
So anyhow, so if something happens to me, she doesn't need to go through the courts and prove that I've named her as the beneficiary of my estate. She just needs to show up at the bank with a death certificate and say, "My husband died, I need to take his name off," and the bank will do that because that's what's assumed when you jointly own something, whether it's a bank account or property, real estate or a car or whatever it is. So the bottom line being, if you have a fancy will, but you make someone a joint owner on your account, your will doesn't do anything. I see this a lot with elderly folks who name one of their children as a joint owner on their account because they want that child to be able to pay the bills for them. That's fine, but they have to understand that if their will says everything goes equally, and their only account is jointly owned with one of their kids, that child is going to become the sole legal owner of that account and is going to have no legal obligation to share that account with anyone else. And in fact, if they do, them sharing that account with the other kids is a legal gift that they might have some consequences for in that way. So it makes things complicated in a way that people don't always appreciate. So that's joint ownership. That's probably the most common one I see. The
Yeah.
second most common one is a beneficiary. So if I have a checking account at the bank and it says that, I have this checking account, I'm the owner, and in the event of my death, it goes to my church or to my neighbor or whatever,
Sure.
that beneficiary designation is going to trump whatever it says in my will or my trust, because the will or the trust is only going to control what's left over after all that is done. So
Mm,
we got to be really aware of that. And that's a way, frankly, a lot of people take advantage of elderly people. They know they don't have to get into my office to fix the will or change the will or the trust. They just have to get down to the bank and have them sign that beneficiary card. And there has been a lot of dastardly deeds done that way, because the
yikes.
bank doesn't, if you sign a beneficiary card at a bank, no one at the bank needs to spend a lot of time figuring out whether you're competent. They don't need to have multiple witnesses. It doesn't need to be notarized. It's just, here's your card. That's what you want to do. Fine. I don't care if there's a suspicious looking person standing next to you, because I'm just a teller at the bank and you asked me for a card and I'm going to give you one. And I'm not belittling the bank, but it's not a
It's their
system
process.
that's set up to protect people.
Yeah, it's their process. So you can't change their process. Wow, that's just surprising. That it's something that I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know the concept of having joint owners or beneficiaries. I mean, most people with insurance policies have beneficiaries. Are
Sure.
they set up correctly and all that stuff? Like the concept that beneficiaries and joint owners trump a will is something I had never heard of. So that's a huge piece of information there.
Well, and you can imagine that that creates a seismic shift in how an estate is distributed as compared to what the person intended.
Mm-hmm.
There can be vastly different outcomes. And that's
But,
another reason why we really like to sit down with people and put together a comprehensive estate plan so we can talk about all those things, because it's not unusual at all for issues like that to come up where someone says, oh yeah, I want everything to be equal. By the way, I have my daughter on this account because I want her to be able to pay the bills. And then I can have a conversation and say, well, just so you know, this is what's going to happen. I met with a funeral director once,
mm,
and he was telling me a horror story about he had a family come in to do the funeral arrangements. Grandma really had used all her assets, and all that was left was a $100,000 life insurance policy that was payable to her granddaughter who was in college.
sure.
Whole family got together to plan the funeral, and it was going to cost whatever, $12,000 or $15,000 or whatever funeral cost. And at the end of the meeting, after they picked out the flowers and the casket and the whatever, the granddaughter stood up and said, just so everyone knows, I'm not paying for any of this. Grandma wanted me to have that money. And she was under no legal obligation to pay. So she walked out of that room without absorbing any of those costs and
Huh.
walking out with all that money, because that hadn't been sort of calculated in Grandma's estate plan. So it that's one of those things that's one of it amazes me that she went to the meeting in the first place. You'd think
Yeah.
if you were to do your family like that, you'd at least have the common courtesy to run away. But she went there and wanted to make sure she got the flowers she wanted too. So
Sheesh.
yeah,
That's some stories there. Oh my goodness. I don't even know. I'm sure you got a ton more stories, but I'm always fascinated by what people might do in those situations. Is there any way that the legal document of the will or the trust can trump the beneficiaries, or is it not possible?
it's not possible. I mean, I guess what I would say is the only way we can make those things work together is when we create a trust, we make the trust the beneficiary. So that if
Oh,
you have a checking account or a life insurance, you make the trust the beneficiary. So then whatever you say in that trust, whether it's providing for our kids as they grow up, we don't want to give them all the money when they turn 18 because that's
sure.
a terrible idea. Or whatever else division is in the document. If we have that trust as the beneficiary, then you're sort of submitting to the whatever the rules of the trust are. But if the
That's
trust names an individual, and that's a real common one I see is for people with young families, when they come in to meet with me, they have a life insurance policy or a 401k, and it's first payable to the spouse
mhm.
and second to the kids. And
Yeah.
who knows, you probably have the same thing right now. And the reality is, if you create a trust, if you hire me and we create the best trust there ever was, and you don't change those beneficiary designations, if something happens to you and your wife, that's all going to go into the name of your children and be accessible to them when they turn either 18 or 21, regardless of what the trust says. So we got to
Hmm,
make sure we get those things squared away.
really interesting. Wow. I mean, I've personally learned a ton on this, and I'm really excited about like understanding even more depth on these things. But I mean, I don't know if I have any more questions yet because I know we've gone through a ton of stuff. Is there anything else that about those three areas that I think are the big three that we're going to cover in this training video? Anything else that jumps out at you that you want people to know about, understand, real as like a last minute thing? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, what comes to mind is the reaction I get when I meet with people. And I think that, there's this sort of specter, and maybe I shouldn't use the word specter in this situation, but there's this sort of aura around estate planning where people come in and think they're picking out the coffin colors
Yeah.
or whatever they think they're doing. And it's very, very common for people to walk out of my office and say, well, that wasn't so bad. Because all we're really doing is talking about what are your priorities? Who do you trust? What do you want for your kids? I tend to have sort of a here's how it usually goes, which I think helps people. They don't have to do it that way. Um, and it really is a very painless process. So I would encourage people, and if I'd obviously be blessed if they wanted to come and work with me, but talk to someone because the process does not have to be stressful and really shouldn't be. We're doing this to avoid stress. So it's something that isn't gonna hurt you or really even upset you to do. You're just talking about your legacy, and it tends to be a very positive conversation.
Good, good, good. Well, fantastic. Guys, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're curious about estate planning, like I definitely was, this is the tip of the iceberg, right? Obviously, Al has been doing this for 15 plus years. He's clearly very knowledgeable, knows his stuff inside and out. Like, if you're thinking about this, if you don't have the power of attorney set up yet, it's not hard, it's not expensive. Like, get this stuff taken care of. You never know what could happen, right? We live in Wisconsin. There's snow 9 months out of the year, right? Things are crazy. So, Al, can you tell everyone how do they get in contact with you if they want to learn about this stuff, sit down with you, talk about this? Where's the best place they should go?
Sure. Probably, well, there's two places. They can go to our website, which is McLario.com, MCLARIO.com. And we have a little quiz on there about, is your estate plan up to date? We're running a deal in May and June, giving people a discount to get this stuff up to date just because it's an important time. And I think a lot of people are thinking about it in a way they haven't been.
Hmm.
So you can do that, or you can just give us a call, 262-251-4210, and set up a time. We're going to send you that 3 or 4 page info sheet and then set up a time to talk to me. I always want people to know that you are not charged to talk to me. We do your initial consultation, and if at the end of that consultation you decide you don't want to go forward, you don't want to go forward with me because you don't like me, whatever, there is no obligation. You will not be charged. You will not get a surprise bill. The only reason you would be charged is if at the end of our consultation, I said, I recommend you do this. You said, yes. I say, this is how much it would cost. You said, I agree. And then we would do it. So there's no
Right.
sneakiness. I always tell people I'm not a high pressure salesman. A lot of people will, I think just because this is something they don't spend a lot of time thinking about, will say, all right, we just need a couple days to think about this. And that's fine with me. And sometimes I call those people 6 months later and say, hey, what we doing this or not? And if they say no, then that's the end of it. So
There
my,
you
my
go.
goal is not to pressure anything. And I think I would rather have people do a consultation with me and get educated than not do anything because they're worried about that. So yeah, those are the two best ways to get a hold of me.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Al. This has been so informative for me personally. I'm very selfishly grateful for this talk, and I know a lot of people are going to benefit from this too. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great day, Al. Okay.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. Take care, man.